a billionaire father. Thought he had it all until a simple dance step with a waitress and his disabled son changed his life forever. Richard Vance was a name that appeared in newspapers, business magazines, and financial television shows. He was one of the richest men in the country, a billionaire known for building a giant tech empire from nothing. People respected him, some even feared him. He was sharp, powerful, and always in control. But the one thing he could never control was the silence of his own house. He lived in a massive mansion with tall glass windows, modern art on the walls, and rooms so big that voices echoed. Yet, despite all the money, there was no laughter, no warmth, and no real family connection in that house. His 10-year-old son, Ethan, lived there too, but they were like strangers under the same roof. Ethan was born with cerebral palsy. He had difficulty walking and talking. His muscles didn't always listen to his brain. While other kids were riding bikes or playing soccer, Ethan was in therapy sessions, learning to move his hands a little better or to form clear words. He needed help with almost everything, but more than anything, he needed love, attention, and time, things Richard never had enough of. Richard wasn't cruel. He wasn't a bad man, but he was always busy. He had meetings to attend, calls to make, deals to close. He would wake up early, go straight to his office, and come back late at night when Ethan was already asleep. The boy was mostly raised by a team of nannies, nurses, and therapists. Richard believed that giving Ethan the best medical care and education was enough. He didn't understand that what Ethan truly wanted was a father who would sit next to him, listen to him, hold his hand, and smile just because they were together. Sometimes, Richard would sit at the edge of Ethan's room door and just watch. The boy would be quietly staring at the ceiling or playing soft music on a tablet. Ethan loved music. It was the only thing that made him move without thinking. When music played, he tried to tap his fingers, rock his head, or smile. But Richard never walked into the room. He would stand there for a minute and then go back to his office. There were photo frames in the living room. Very few had pictures of Ethan. Most were business awards, certificates, and photos of Richard shaking hands with other powerful people. Ethan's world, his emotions, his dreams, none of them had found a place in Richard's shiny empire. The truth was, Richard was scared. He didn't know how to talk to Ethan. He didn't know how to handle his son's silence, his slow movements, or his blank stares. He didn't want to fail, so instead of trying, he avoided. He buried himself in work, thinking that success in business would somehow make up for what he lacked at home. People around him never questioned it. They respected his privacy. At company events, when someone asked about his son, Richard would just smile politely and say, "He's doing well." No one ever asked more. And so, the years passed, with Richard growing richer and Ethan growing lonelier. But Ethan had a soft heart. Even though his body didn't always move the way he wanted, his mind understood everything. He noticed his father's absence. He saw the way other dads played with their children. He didn't ask for toys or video games. He just wanted a hug, a walk in the garden, or someone to sit and watch the stars with him. But those moments never came. Ethan's nanny, Rosa, was kind. She tried her best to fill the emptiness in his life. She would play music for him, read stories, and sometimes sing lullabies when he couldn't sleep. She often said, "Your father loves you, Ethan. He just doesn't know how to show it." But Ethan was beginning to doubt that. His heart longed for something he had never really experienced, a father's presence. One day, something unusual happened. Richard's assistant, Laura, came into his office and said, "Sir, your meeting with the board has been canceled. There's a power outage at the downtown office." Richard, who was already dressed in his suit and ready to present, was annoyed. "What about the lunch meeting with the investors?" he asked. "They postponed it to tomorrow." He checked his calendar. For the first time in months, he had no meetings scheduled for the next few hours. At that very moment, Rosa called. She explained that she had a family emergency and needed to leave for the evening. The backup nanny was stuck in traffic. There was no one else to stay with Ethan. Richard sighed. "Fine. I'll take care of him for tonight," he said.
Oh.
Though he wasn't sure what taking care even meant. He went home and saw Ethan sitting on the couch, holding a soft pillow and humming to a tune only he could hear. Ethan looked up at his father, surprised. It wasn't usual for Richard to come home before dark. Richard stood there awkwardly, holding his phone and laptop bag. "Hungry?" Richard asked, not knowing what else to say. Ethan nodded slightly. Richard didn't know how to cook. The house staff had the night off. So he did something unexpected. He decided to take Ethan out for dinner. He didn't want to go to one of those fancy places with strict dress codes and silent halls. Ethan wouldn't be comfortable there, so he let the driver take them somewhere nearby. After a short drive, they arrived at a small jazz-themed restaurant. The name was painted in colorful letters and soft music played from speakers near the door. Richard hesitated. It wasn't the kind of place he usually went to. It was lively, filled with regular people, and had no business suits in sight. But Ethan looked curious, his eyes following the sound of the saxophone playing inside. Richard helped his son out of the car and led him into the restaurant. The place was warm, filled with smiling faces, laughter, and the smell of fresh food. A small live band played at the corner, and a few people were dancing near their tables. Ethan's face lit up. It was like the music woke something inside him, started moving his fingers and nodding slowly. A cheerful waitress walked up to them. She was a black woman in her early 30s, wearing a bright yellow scarf and a big smile. Her name tag read Jasmine. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, looking at Ethan kindly. "Can I help you find a nice table?" Richard nodded, somewhere quiet if possible. Jasmine led them to a cozy corner table near the music, but far enough from the dancing crowd. She looked at Ethan and said softly, "You like music, huh?" Ethan smiled a little and nodded. "I can tell," she said, then looked at Richard. It was good taste. Richard was surprised. Most people didn't talk directly to Ethan. They talked around him, to the nurse or the nanny. But Jasmine didn't treat him like a sick child. She treated him like a person. They ordered food, simple stuff, grilled cheese for Ethan and a steak for Richard. While they waited, Jasmine came by often to check on them. She told Ethan about the songs being played, the names of the instruments, and even brought over a small tambourine for him to try. Ethan held it carefully and shook it with excitement. Richard watched quietly, wasn't used to seeing Ethan this animated. For the first time, his son wasn't just sitting still or looking at a screen. He was reacting, smiling, enjoying himself. Richard didn't know whether to feel happy or ashamed. Why hadn't he ever brought his son to a place like this before? The night went on, the music got livelier. More people got up to dance. Jasmine clapped along with the beat and suddenly turned to Ethan. "You want to try something?" she asked. Ethan looked unsure. Richard frowned slightly, worried. But before he could say anything, Jasmine gently took Ethan's hand. "I'll help you." "You'll be the boss," she said. She led him slowly to a small space near the band. The crowd noticed, but didn't judge. They moved aside respectfully. The band saw what was happening and softened their tune to match the moment. Jasmine placed Ethan's hands in hers and began a slow, easy rhythm. She moved only when Ethan moved. She let him lead. If he tapped once, she tapped once. If he rocked to the left, she followed. The room grew quiet, watching something special unfold. Ethan's face glowed with joy and pride. He was dancing. He was leading. And everyone was following. Richard stood frozen. Something in his heart twisted and broke open. In that moment, he didn't see a disabled child. He saw his son, beautiful, brave, bright soul, who had so much to give of. Only someone would let him. He felt tears rise to his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about business, deadlines, or profits. He was thinking about Ethan, really thinking about him that night. As they drove home, Ethan rested his head on his father's shoulder. Richard didn't move away. He put his arm around his son and held him close. It felt unfamiliar, but it also felt right. He didn't know it yet, but something inside him had shifted forever. A simple night, a kind waitress, a small dance, and the wall between. A father and son had finally started to come down. The next morning after their dinner at the jazz-themed restaurant, Richard Vance sat alone in his kitchen. A cup of black coffee was getting cold on the table. He didn't touch it. He was staring at nothing in particular, just thinking. The night before kept playing in his mind again and again. He couldn't stop thinking about Ethan on that small dance floor. Moving gently with Jasmine, the waitress who had somehow seen something in his son that he hadn't. It had been such a simple thing, yet it shook Richard in a way that years of therapy, parenting books, or medical reports never had. In all the years he had been a father, he had never seen Ethan that alive, that confident, that full of happiness. And he hadn't been the one to make it happen. It was a stranger waitress who brought it out of his son. He kept hearing Jasmine's words echo in his mind. "You'll be the boss." She had said those words to Ethan without hesitation, and his son believed her. He believed he could lead, and then he did. That moment, just a few minutes long, had shown Richard what he had been missing for 10 years. It wasn't money, it wasn't medicine, and it wasn't control. It was connection. Later that morning, Richard walked into Ethan's room. Usually he knocked and waited for the nanny to invite him in. But this time, he walked in slowly by himself. Ethan was sitting up in bed, watching a music video on his tablet. When he saw his father, his eyes lit up. It wasn't a big smile, but there was a softness in his face, a look that said, "I remember last night." Richard sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Good morning, buddy." Ethan nodded slowly and tapped the screen to pause the video. Richard glanced at it. It was a jazz performance. The boy remembered everything. Richard rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. He wasn't used to small talk, especially not with his son. "Did you like the restaurant?" he asked. Ethan nodded again. Richard smiled nervously. "You were amazing out there, dancing. I didn't know you could move like that." Ethan gave a little grin, then looked down. Richard noticed Ethan's hands resting on his lap. They were still a bit shaky, but more relaxed than usual. Something inside, Richard said, "Don't leave yet." So he stayed. He picked up the tablet and played the video again, watching it with his son. The two of them sat side by side in silence, listening to the sound of the trumpet filling the room. Later that afternoon, when his assistant Laura called to remind him of a meeting, Richard replied, "Cancel it. I'm spending the day with Ethan." There was a pause on the other end, and then Laura said, "Of course, sir." It was the first time she had ever heard him say those words. Richard didn't know what he was doing, not really. But he knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. So he started small. He took Ethan to the park, not the private one behind their mansion, but a public park where other children were playing. He pushed his son's wheelchair slowly along the walking path. People noticed them, but no one stared for long. Ethan pointed at ducks in the pond, and Richard told him stories about when he used to feed ducks as a boy. They even laughed a little. The next evening, Richard found himself dialing the number of the restaurant. He didn't know why, but he felt like he had to go back. Maybe it was to say thank you. Maybe it was something more. A young man answered. The phone-in said the name of the restaurant cheerfully. Richard asked, "Is Jasmine working tonight?" There was a pause. Yeah, she's here. Can I take a message?" "Just tell her the father and son from last night say thank you. That's all." He hung up quickly, feeling embarrassed. Something told him she would understand. The next week, Richard took Ethan back to the restaurant. This time it was on purpose. He made sure Ethan wore his favorite blue shirt, the one with musical notes on the collar. As they entered, the familiar smell and soft jazz music greeted them again. Jasmine saw them right away and broke into a big smile. "Well, look who's back," she said warmly, walking over with her notepad. Richard stood up from his chair for a second. "I just wanted to thank you, for what you did." Jasmine waved her hand casually. "Oh no, don't make a big deal of it. Your son, he's got rhythm. All I did was let it shine." Richard looked at her with something close to wonder. "You made him feel seen. That's rare." Jasmine smiled more softly this time. "Everyone deserves to be seen, especially kids like him. Too many people look right past them." They ordered food again, and Jasmine brought over a small drum, this time for Ethan. "Just tap along if you want to," she said. As the evening went on, Jasmine sat with them during her short break. She told them a little about herself, how she grew up with a younger brother named Micah who had Down syndrome. He had loved music too. Micah passed away 5 years ago, she said gently, but he taught me more about love and strength than anyone else ever could. Richard listened, not just with his ears, but with his heart. He understood now why she had connected with Ethan so naturally. She'd lived it before. They stayed longer that night. Ethan danced again this time. With a little more confidence, other guests clapped along. Richard didn't even look at his phone once. He just watched, fully present, his eyes following every small movement of his son's hands and feet. On the drive home, Ethan rested his hand on his father's. Richard held it tightly. The changes in Richard didn't stop there. At home, he began spending more time with Ethan. He adjusted his schedule to be home for dinner. He started attending therapy sessions, asking questions, learning exercises, and even trying them with Ethan. The boy responded in ways no one had seen before. His progress picked up speed, not just physically, but emotionally. Smiled more. He laughed. He hugged. Richard also began paying attention to the people around Ethan, the therapists, the aides, the caregivers. He realized they were all underpaid and overworked, and he quietly gave them raises and more support. He asked for their opinions. He wanted to understand what his son's world looked like, what it felt like. But more than anything, he kept returning. To the restaurant. Not every night, but often. It became a place of peace, joy, and learning. Jasmine and Ethan developed a friendship that was beautiful to watch. She taught him little dance steps, told him funny stories, and even brought him a used keyboard once. Let him feel the music with his fingers, she said. One night, after the music had ended and the lights were dim, Richard stayed back to talk to Jasmine privately. They sat in a booth while Ethan slept in his wheelchair beside them. "I think you've changed my life," Richard said, almost whispering. Jasmine chuckled. "I think he changed it. I just helped him speak without words." Richard nodded slowly. "You know, I've spent millions of dollars trying to help Ethan. Doctors, schools, equipment. But nothing gave him what you did in 5 minutes. Saw him. You gave him a chance to be something more than a patient or a child with a disability." Jasmine looked at Ethan, then back at Richard. All he ever needed was someone to believe he could. That's it. That's where it all begins. Words stayed with Richard. They followed him home, into his thoughts, into his sleep. The next morning, he called his company's board and told them he wanted to step back from daily operations. They were shocked. Some even tried to talk him out of it. But Richard was firm. "I need to be with my son," he said simply. He wasn't quitting. He was just choosing something more important. His own life. A few days later, he met with a group of designers and developers and told them he wanted to create something new, a program that would help children with disabilities express themselves through music, art, and dance. He wanted it to be accessible, affordable, and full of joy. Something that celebrated ability, not disability. He named it Ethan's Rhythm. When the media got wind of it, people praised him. Interviews were requested, headlines were written, but Richard didn't care about any of that. All he cared about was that Ethan, his son, was happy, that they were finally building something real together. At the restaurant, Jasmine was given a special invitation. Richard asked her to be part of the new foundation. "You've got the heart. You know how to reach people like Ethan. I want you on the team," he said. Jasmine smiled wide. "I'd be honored." And so, from one unplanned dinner, a whole new life had begun. A life of color, of rhythm, of human connection. A life where a powerful man finally understood that real power lies not in money, but in love, in listening, and in being present. The restaurant remained their special place. Every week they came back. Ethan danced. Jasmine laughed. Watched, and sometimes joined. It wasn't perfect. There were hard days. But now there was hope. There was music. And above all, there was a bond between a father and son that no longer needed words to be felt. It had been a few months since the night Richard and Ethan first met Jasmine at the restaurant. In that short time, so much had changed. What began as a casual dinner had now turned into a friendship that grew deeper by the day. Richard often found himself wondering how such a small moment, just a simple dance between a boy and a waitress, could have shifted the entire direction of his life. But the truth was, it wasn't a small moment. It was the spark that lit something long. Buried inside him, every week they returned to the restaurant, not as a billionaire and his son, but as two people seeking something more meaningful: laughter, music, and connection. Ethan looked forward to those evenings like nothing else. Each time they walked into the restaurant, his eyes would light up, and his fingers would start tapping in rhythm, even before the music began. Jasmine always greeted them like old friends. Sometimes she brought small gifts for Ethan: a book about jazz, a harmonica, a funny card with music notes drawn in crayon. Other times, she simply brought her energy and kindness, which mattered even more. One particular evening, the restaurant was hosting an open mic night. Local performers were invited to share their talent singing, playing instruments, even poetry. The place was buzzing with excitement. Jasmine came to their table with a mischievous smile. "Guess what?" she said. "I signed you guys up." Richard blinked. "For what?" "For the open mic," she grinned. "Well, I signed Ethan up. You'll just be backup." Richard laughed nervously. "He doesn't sing, and I definitely don't sing." Jasmine winked, "Then just clap along. He's going to play the keyboard." Richard looked at Ethan. His son was already looking at the small stage in the corner. His fingers were twitching, almost like they were eager to touch the keys. They had brought the keyboard that Jasmine had gifted Ethan a few weeks earlier. It had been sitting in his room, and he practiced with it nearly every day. Richard had seen him get lost in the sound, tapping each key gently like they were puzzle pieces fitting together in his heart. Ethan never said much, but when he played, it felt like he was speaking that night. When it was their turn, Jasmine helped set up the keyboard on stage. She whispered something in Ethan's ear before he went up, and the boy gave a small nod. Then he rolled forward, his wheelchair stopping in front of the keyboard like it had always belonged there. Richard stood beside him, unsure what to do. But he didn't need to do anything. Ethan placed his fingers gently on the keys and began to play. It wasn't perfect. Some notes were late, others were off-key. But there was something magical about it. The way his face lit up with each sound, the way the room fell silent, the way people began to sway slowly, feeling the emotion in every note. And Richard, standing beside his son, didn't feel nervous anymore. He felt proud. When the song ended, there was a pause of breath held in the room, and then the audience erupted in applause. Ethan didn't smile wide, but his eyes sparkled. And for Richard, that was everything. Later that night, as they sat at their table with empty plates and full hearts, Jasmine joined them again. "You were incredible," she told Ethan. "You made everyone feel something." Richard looked at her and said, "You know, I used to think success was about power, about how many people knew your name. But tonight, watching him play, I felt more successful than I've ever felt in my life." Jasmine nodded. "It's because you're finally living your truth, not someone else's idea of it." Richard thought about that for a long time. He was beginning to realize that all the years he spent building his empire, buying companies, investing in buildings, appearing on magazine covers, had given him everything except real peace. That peace had arrived not in a boardroom, but in a jazz restaurant. From a waitress with a heart big enough to hold both pain and joy, over the next few weeks, Richard began planning something bigger. He wanted to create a center, one that combined music, therapy, and support for children with disabilities. A place that welcomed everyone, no matter their background or ability. He decided to call it Ethan's Rhythm, after the journey his son had taken. He invited Jasmine to be part of it. "I need someone like you," he said. "You see what most people miss?" Jasmine was surprised, but deeply moved. "I'm just a waitress," she said softly. "No," Richard replied. "You're a teacher, a healer, and maybe the only person who's ever shown me who my son really is." Jasmine agreed, and the two began working together to build the foundation of the center. They brought in therapists, musicians, educators, and artists. The vision was simple. Every child, no matter their challenge, should have the chance to feel heard, seen, and celebrated. During this time, Richard spent more and more time with Ethan. They began having breakfast together every morning. Not rushed, not distracted, just the two of them talking, listening, even sitting in silence when words weren't needed. Richard learned to read Ethan's signals, the way his eyes moved when he was curious, the way his fingers twitched when he was anxious, the little grunts he made when he wanted a song played again. They were learning a new language, one built on patience and love. One afternoon, Jasmine came over to their house. It was the first time she saw where they lived. She walked through the grand gates, past the fountains, and into a home filled with luxury, but very little warmth. Richard welcomed her in with a shy smile. Ethan rolled out to greet her, his face lighting up at the sight of his friend. Jasmine spent the day with them, helping Ethan make music in the living room. She brought shakers, tambourines, and a small drum. The sound of laughter and rhythm filled the halls in a way it never had before as the sun began to set. Jasmine stepped outside with Richard. "This house is huge," she said. Richard nodded. "Too big for two people. I used to think filling it with stuff would make it feel like a home. But now I realize it's people who do that." Jasmine looked at him thoughtfully. "You've changed," Richard smiled. "I think I'm just starting to become who I was always supposed to be." That night he sat beside Ethan as he fell asleep, holding his son's hand. There were no words, no music, just the quiet, steady sound of breathing. And for the first time in years, Richard didn't feel lost, but not everything was smooth. There were still moments of fear, moments of doubt. Sometimes Richard felt like he was too late, that he had missed too many years. He worried whether Ethan remembered all the times he hadn't been there, whether his son still carried those absences inside. One evening, Richard sat with Jasmine after a long planning session. They were exhausted, but satisfied with their progress. "Worried that I was a terrible father," he admitted quietly. "I was always away. I thought I was doing it for him, building a future, but I was building it without him."
Ow.
Jasmine placed her hand on his. "It's never too late to show up. Every moment you're here now, it matters. Ethan knows. Kids feel love. They know when it's real." Richard looked down. "I just want him to be proud of me." Jasmine smiled. "He already is." As the launch of Ethan's rhythm approached, excitement grew. People began to hear about the project a center built. By a billionaire father and inspired by a silent boy who spoke best through music, donations came in. Volunteers signed up. But more than that, families from across the city reached out, desperate for a place where their children could be celebrated. Shh. On the day of the opening, the center was filled with laughter, music, and color. Children danced, played instruments, painted, and explored. Ethan was given the honor of playing the first song on the center's grand piano. He sat proudly at the keys, Jasmine by his side, and played a melody he had practiced. For weeks, Richard stood in the back, watching with wet eyes. As the last note echoed through the hall, the room erupted in applause. But Richard didn't clap, simply put his hand over his heart and whispered, "Thank you." That night, after the opening ceremony, Richard and Jasmine sat in the empty music room while Ethan napped nearby. The walls were covered with art made by the children who had already started visiting. Jasmine leaned back and said, "I think Micah would have loved this place." Richard looked at her. "You talk about him a lot." She smiled gently. "Was everything to me. When I lost him, I thought I'd never find that kind of joy again. But your son, he reminds me so much of Micah, not just because of his challenges, but because of his strength. His light." Richard nodded. "I think your brother sent you to us." Jasmine didn't answer. She just smiled, and in her eyes there was a soft glow. The center continued to grow. New programs were added. A recording studio was built. Artists, musicians, and therapists began teaching classes. Ethan's photo was framed at the entrance, right next to a quote that read, "Everyone deserves to lead their own dance." The words were Jasmine's. As time went on, Richard became more than just a donor or founder. He became part of a movement, one that challenged the way the world looked at children with disabilities. He gave speeches not about business, but about love. He shared Ethan's story. He talked about how one act of kindness from a stranger had opened the door to a new life. And through it all, Jasmine stood by his side. They were an unlikely pair, a billionaire and a waitress. But together, they built something far greater than either of them had imagined. They built a place where music healed, where children. The music center was now alive with dreams. What had once been an empty building was now filled with laughter, rhythm, and color. Children who had never danced were moving freely. Kids who were once too shy to speak were singing with bright eyes. Parents who had long felt hopeless were sitting in quiet corners, watching their children find joy. And in the middle of all this was Ethan, silent, smiling, and shining like never before. Richard had begun spending most of his time at the center. He still ran his businesses, but something inside him had changed. Every meeting he attended, every deal he signed, now felt secondary. The real joy came from the mornings he spent in music rooms, the lunches with children at the center's cafeteria, and the evenings watching Ethan practice with his music group. His son was no longer hidden behind walls or misunderstood. Ethan had found a place where he wasn't just accepted, he was admired. Jasmine had become an important part of the center. She wasn't just someone who danced with kids or played music. She was the soul of the building. Everyone from children to parents to staff felt drawn to her. Her laughter was like sunlight. Her hugs were healing. Her voice, calm and warm, could settle even the most restless heart. Richard had always admired her kindness, but now he had also begun to notice something deeper: her strength. They spent many hours together, working late, making plans for new programs, organizing community events. His men brought creative ideas, music festivals, dance workshops, storytelling, evenings. Richard helped turn those ideas into real things, using his money and connections. They were becoming a team that balanced each other perfectly. She taught him patience, and he gave her the tools to reach more people. Slowly, a quiet friendship between them began to grow into something more emotional. But neither of them rushed. They respected each other's pasts. And they were building a future, step by step. One day, something unexpected happened. Richard received a phone call from a well-known TV producer. She had heard about Ethan's rhythm and wanted to feature their story in a national documentary. At first, Richard was unsure. He had never been comfortable with media attention on his private life. But the producer explained that sharing Ethan's story could help inspire other parents, especially those with special children. Jasmine encouraged him. "If even one parent feels less alone after watching it, it's worth it," she said. So they agreed. The crew came to the center a week later. Cameras followed the children during music lessons and dance sessions. Interviews were filmed with staff, volunteers, and parents. When it was Richard's turn, he sat in the music room where Ethan had first played publicly. "I was a man who thought success came from numbers, buildings, and power," he said. "But true success was sitting right next to me for years, and I couldn't see it. It took one kind-hearted woman, one moment of music, and one brave little boy to teach me what love really looks like." When the crew asked Jasmine about her role, she smiled softly. "I'm not a therapist or a teacher. I'm just someone who believes in people. I lost someone very dear to me, my brother Micah. He had special needs too. For a long time I felt like I had failed him. But meeting Ethan gave me a second chance to love someone like him again. Healed a part of me I didn't know was still broken." The documentary aired 2 weeks later, touched hearts all across the country. Thousands of messages flooded the center's website. Parents wanted to bring their children. Volunteers wanted to help. Donors wanted to support the cause. The story of Ethan, Richard, and Jasmine had become a light for many who were lost in the dark. One night, Richard and Jasmine sat on the roof of the center after everyone had left. They looked at the stars, tired but happy. "Do you ever feel like we were meant to meet?" Richard asked quietly. Jasmine looked at him, her eyes gentle. "I do. I think the universe has strange ways of bringing people together." He nodded. "I used to think I had everything. But now, I realized that until I met you and watched you dance with Ethan that night, I had nothing." Jasmine didn't reply for a moment. Then she reached out and held his hand. "I think we're all just searching for something real," she said. Their hands stayed together, fingers wrapped in a silent promise. The next few weeks brought more. Joy, a famous jazz musician, visited the center and offered to give monthly classes. A local school partnered with them to bring children in for art therapy. A small recording studio was built inside the center where children could create their own songs. Ethan recorded his first piece of music there, just a few soft keys, with a background of birdsong and rain. It was simple, but it moved everyone to tears. But life, as always, had its own tests. One morning, Ethan woke up with a fever. At first, Richard thought it was nothing serious. Kids get sick. But when Ethan began shaking and having trouble breathing, they rushed him to the hospital. Doctors worked quickly. They found that Ethan had an infection that had reached his lungs. His weak immune system made it harder for his body to fight back. Richard sat beside his hospital bed, heart pounding. Jasmine arrived within an hour and didn't leave his side. For 2 days, they watched as doctors gave medicine, ran tests, and adjusted machines. Ethan's small body looked even smaller under the white sheets. Richard held his hand, whispering softly, "Stay strong, son. I need you. The world needs you." The third day, Ethan opened his eyes and gave a faint smile. It was enough. The next week, Ethan slowly recovered. Doctors praised his strength, but Richard knew it wasn't just medicine. It was the love surrounding him that pulled him back. After Ethan was discharged, the three of them returned to the center. Everyone welcomed them with cheers, hugs, and welcomes. And happy tears. Richard realized something important that day. The center was no longer just a project, it was a family, and Ethan was its heart. Soon after, Richard made a big decision. He announced that he would be stepping down from many of his SCE business responsibilities. He would keep his companies running, but would hand over day-to-day work to trusted teams. His focus now would be on the center, on children, and on creating more places like Ethan's Rhythm in other cities. "I chased money for years," he said in a press conference. "Now, I want to chase meaning." He also made a personal decision. One evening, after Ethan had gone to sleep, Richard asked Jasmine to take a walk with him in the center's garden. The air was cool. The wind carried soft music from inside the building. "I have something to say," Richard began, his voice unsure but steady. "I never believed I could love again after losing Ethan's mother. You've changed me. You've shown me what love without fear looks like." Jasmine looked at him, her eyes beginning to fill. "I've loved you for a while," Richard continued. "Not just because of what you did for Ethan, but because of who you are. Strong, kind, brave. I want us to be a family. Not just for Ethan. For all of us." Tears rolled down Jasmine's cheeks. "I was scared to hope for this," she whispered, "but I feel the same." They embraced under the moonlight, surrounded by the sounds of music, laughter, and a love that had grown slowly, honestly, and deeply. They didn't rush into marriage. Instead, they took their time. They focused on building their home into a place filled with warmth. Jasmine moved in with them after a few months. The house, once quiet and cold, was now full of music, art, and life. Ethan thrived. He smiled more. He began using a tablet to communicate with simple words. His confidence grew. He even began guiding younger children at the center, showing them how to use instruments and helping them learn sounds. One day a parent said, "Your son is the reason mine smiled today." Richard, once known only as a business tycoon, became something far greater, a father who showed up every day, a man who changed lives not with money, but with heart. In the background of it all stood Jasmine. Her dance that night in the restaurant had changed a life. But her continued love had changed the world around her, from strangers to friends, from pain to healing, from silence to song. Their journey had become something rare and beautiful, and the rhythm of their hearts, Richard's, Jasmine's, and Ethan's, was now beating as one. The years that followed were filled with hope, growth, and deep love. The music center that Richard and Jasmine had built, named Ethan's Rhythm, had become a beacon of light not only for their community, but for families far beyond the city. Stories began to spread about the place where every child, no matter their ability, was celebrated. It was a place where disabilities were not seen as limits, but as different ways of experiencing the world. Richard and Jasmine worked tirelessly to expand their vision. With the success of their first center, they began planning new locations in other cities, each designed to meet the needs of local families. They organized conferences and workshops for parents and teachers, sharing the lessons they had learned from Ethan's journey and from the many children they had met along the way. They invited experts in music therapy, special education, and healthcare to collaborate and create new methods of support. Despite all their achievements, Richard never lost sight of what mattered most: his son. Ethan grew older, learning to communicate better through technology and music. His wheelchair became a symbol not of limitation but of freedom, carrying him to places he had only dreamed of before. His music, once soft and hesitant, now rang with confidence and joy. He composed pieces that told stories of struggle, of hope, and of love. One afternoon, Richard watched Ethan perform on stage at a community event. His son's fingers danced over the keyboard with skill and passion, a wide smile on his face. The audience was captivated, not just by the music, but by the boy's spirit. After the performance, a young girl approached Ethan and whispered, "You inspire me." Richard felt his chest swell with pride. In that moment, he understood the true power of their work. It wasn't just about providing resources or therapy, it was about inspiring courage and hope. Jasmine stood beside him, holding his hand. "We did this," she said softly. "No," Richard replied. "Ethan did this. He taught us all how to live." Their family life was filled with small, beautiful moments. Richard and Jasmine shared quiet breakfasts with Ethan where he would hymn his favorite tunes. They celebrated birthdays with music and dancing, sometimes inviting families from the center to join. They took trips to the countryside, where Ethan loved the sounds of birds and the feel of the wind on his face. They laughed together, cried together, and faced challenges together. But life was not without struggles. There were times when Ethan's health worsened. Sometimes he would become frustrated by his limitations, and Richard would hold him close, whispering words of comfort. Jasmine became an expert at understanding the subtle signs of his pain or discomfort. Together, they navigated doctor's appointments, therapy sessions, and the ups and downs of daily life. One winter, Ethan caught a serious cold that led to pneumonia. This time the illness was harder to fight. Richard stayed at the hospital day and night, refusing to leave his son's side. Jasmine brought warm blankets, favorite toys, and her calming presence. Friends and families from the center sent messages of support and prayers. The nights were long and filled with worry. Richard thought back to the night when Ethan was first hospitalized years ago, and he realized how much he had grown, not just as a father, but as a person. He knew now that love meant showing up even when it was hard, even when the future was uncertain. After weeks of care, Ethan slowly improved. The doctors said his strength and spirit had played a big role in his recovery. Richard thanked every nurse and doctor, but he also gave thanks for the community they had built, a family that surrounded Ethan with love. As Ethan recovered, Richard and Jasmine made a promise to themselves and to their son. They would keep fighting for children like Ethan, making sure no family felt alone or forgotten. They would keep growing the centers, raising awareness, changing the world's view of disability. In the meantime, Ethan's music continued to grow. He recorded an album with the help of the center's recording studio, sharing his feelings and stories through sound. The album was called Rhythms of Hope. It became popular among families with special needs children and even reached listeners who had never thought about disability before. Ethan's music was simple but powerful, reminding people that every life has a unique melody. One day, Richard received an invitation to speak at a global conference on disability and inclusion. It was an opportunity to share Ethan's story. On a much bigger stage, nervous but determined, Richard accepted. On the day of his speech, he stood in front of an audience of thousands, including leaders, advocates, and parents. He spoke openly about his journey from a man focused on wealth and success to a father who learned the true meaning of love through his son. He said, "Ethan taught me that real strength is not in what we own, but in how we love. That every child, no matter their challenge, deserves the chance to shine. I stand here not as a billionaire, but as a father, and I ask all of you to see the beauty in every life." The audience gave a standing ovation. After the speech, many came forward to thank him. Some shared their own stories. Others pledged support for Ethan's rhythm centers. It was a moment of hope and connection. Back home, Richard and Jasmine watched Ethan play piano in the garden, sunlight falling softly on his face. They held hands, grateful for the journey they had taken together, the twists, the pain, the joy, and the love. Jasmine whispered, "Look at him, he's changed so much." Richard smiled. "He changed all of us." Ah! And as the music floated through the air, their hearts beat in time with Ethan's rhythm, strong, steady, and full of life. Their story, once small and private, had grown into a movement. A reminder that sometimes the smallest moments, a dance step, a kind smile, a shared song, can change lives forever.